Permaculture is more than just a gardening technique. It's a way of life. In this episode, we're going to explore the benefits of incorporating permaculture principles in your garden, including increasing biodiversity, sustainability, and reducing maintenance. I'll also provide some helpful tips for getting started with permaculture in your own garden or on your little homestead. Let's get growing. Hello, and welcome to the Purposeful Plant Podcast, the show that talks about growing a garden, a homestead, a healthy family, and most importantly, growing closer to God. I'm your host, Crystal Media, owner of the Red Ridge Farm Homestead, where our mission is to help women of faith find the courage to grow healthy food for their family while building a closer relationship with our Lord and Savior. If that's you, don't let the world hold you back. Pray, just plant. Hello, fellow growers, and welcome to the Pray Just Plant podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Media, and today in Season 10, Episode 4, we're going to dive into permaculture. Growing a garden was one of the first steps I made when my family and I started this homesteading lifestyle. It wasn't very big, and the yield the first year was atrocious, to say the least. I'll tell you, we did not put up any protectant fence. We just wanted to grow. We just wanted to get those seeds in the ground. And where we live, we had lots of wildlife come in and eat that first garden. But now, more than 20 years into my garden journey, I thought I would address a question I get a lot from beginner growers. What is one thing that you would have done differently when it came to growing your garden? Well, I actually have two answers to that. One, I wish I would have found a mentor. Yes, my mother-in-law tried to help. Yes, I did a little bit of gardening with my mother as a child, but I wish there was someone that I could have talked to a little bit more about different practices. And in a way, I kind of found some mentors in books. They were a great asset. Elliot Coleman was one large mentor of mine. I have several of his books, but I wish I just had someone that I could just talk to face, ask my questions, bring out to my property, say, look, this is my problem, help me. But I also wish I would have learned about permaculture sooner. Using permaculture on our homestead, let alone in our garden, has created an abundance I never thought possible on our little homestead. It has been the way we have tapped into God's creation and His systems and created more. It doesn't matter what stage you are at in your purposeful growing success path. Permaculture is the key to piece to every stage. So no matter if this is your first year growing a garden or your 10th, I have a question for you. Is your garden a constant source of frustration? Do you spend countless hours battling pests and weeds? I know I did. Only to be disappointed with the results? It's time to try a different approach. Permaculture. And I think the true basis of this is that permaculture is a lifestyle. This holistic method of gardening focuses on sustainability, biodiversity, soil health, and creating a thriving garden that requires less maintenance and care. In this episode, we're going to explore the basics of permaculture and its benefits for your garden. I'm going to also provide some tips for getting started and implementing permaculture techniques to achieve a landscape that is not only beautiful, but also sustainable. So the topics we're going to cover are Permaculture 101. We're going to talk about how it works and what it is, the benefits of permaculture in your garden, getting started with permaculture in your backyard or on your little homestead, and permaculture techniques to boost your soil health and biodiversity. The most important asset, I think, in the garden when you bring permaculture into the garden. So let's get started. Permaculture is a sustainable approach to gardening that focuses and growing, essentially. The focus is on creating a self-sustaining ecosystem. Instead of using conventional techniques like chemical fertilizers and pesticides, permaculture relies on God's natural processes, maintain soil health, maximize biodiversity. Let's dive into that word just a little bit more. Biodiversity is where we bring difference with that word diversity. And bio means other animals or other plants or other living things. And also minimizing waste. At its core, permaculture is about creating a regenerative system that benefits not just the plants, but also the surrounding environment. By using techniques like companion planting and mulching and composting, permaculture gardens can create an ecosystem that supports a wide range of plants and animal species. That's where we're getting into that biodiversity, right? I'm going to be sharing a few examples of how I use permaculture principles in my garden, but if you'd like to dive deeper into this permaculture design design and permaculture on your homestead and really bringing it into your lifestyle, I walked through each permaculture principle in a blog post series that I did last year. And I think I also did a podcast series with it as well, where I walked through every part of creating permaculture design on your property. I talked about how you can set goals. I talked about how each principle can be utilized and what each principle stands for and what the purpose behind it. We talked about the 3 tenets of permaculture. We also dived in deep into what I do here on Red Ridge Farmstead that really integrates that permaculture principles and design. Because in the purposeful growing success path, when it gets to the stage of a purposeful homestead, yes, there's adding animals to your homestead is the definition of a homestead, not just a garden anymore, but you're bringing animals into the equation. But to help you in that stage, I dive in a little bit deeper because I know you can find lots of information on how to raise pigs and how to raise this and how to do that. But permaculture, I think, is so important in not only just how we raise our animals, but how do we integrate our animals on our property so they connect with the garden and they connect with our home and they connect with the way our property is situated, and that is permaculture design. Just grow is the first stage, purposeful kitchen is the second stage, purposeful home is the third stage, purposeful garden, which we're kind of in today, is the 4th stage, and purposeful homestead is the 5th stage. Now, you may be in a mix of stages or you may be in certain stages, but the purposeful growing success path is where I have broke down a growing journey into stages so that when you are struggling to know what to learn next or how to really take hold of the stage you're in, you know what you need to know or learn so that you can move on to the next stage. And the last stage is purposeful life. That's where we take all of the little pieces and we put them together and we maybe make an income or really essentially start growing pretty much 80 to 90% of our food at home. So I will put the link to that podcast series in the show notes and in the description below. So one key principle of permaculture is to work with nature, not against it. For example, instead of trying to eliminate pests with chemicals, permaculture gardeners create habitats for natural predators like ladybugs and praying mantises that can keep pest population in check. I do this in my garden by creating a hedge of roses or flowers just inside my garden fence. Now, like I told you 20 years ago, we didn't have a garden fence and the predators came in. But right along my garden fence, I have always found, and with permaculture, you have edges. That's another permaculture principle that in nature, if you think about it, between the place where you go, maybe you're up in the mountains and you have the prairie or the meadow, and then you go into the forest, that edge has lots of life, lots of abundance. Well, in a garden, sometimes we forget about the edge of our gardens because that's the fence. Well, what if we bring in that edge about a foot and actually plant right there instead of having to weed eat it every year or put down some kind of extra mulch there to keep the weeds down, because it's hard to maintain a garden right up to the garden's edge or along that fence line. So what I have done is I've created beds that go along the garden and I mulch it in really deep. I have cardboard that goes underneath the fence and actually garden on the other side. I have more flowers on the other side, so I create a flower garden or a natural hedge. I do have the fence because some predators still don't see that hedge is there, but I grow roses and different flowers along there. One, because it brings in another permaculture principle that everything should be of a benefit. Well, flowers are a benefit to pollinators. They're also a benefit. They're going to create a space for those natural predator insects, but they're also going to bring joy and happiness to me, the gardener, because it brings beauty. So that's one way that you can really emphasize and use 2 permaculture principles where you are creating an ecosystem for animals and you're utilizing that edge. Permaculture also emphasizes the importance of soil health by using techniques like crop rotation, cover cropping. Permaculture gardeners can maintain healthy soil that is rich in organic matter and full of beneficial microorganisms. A few weeks ago, I shared with you a podcast episode all about this topic. You're not just a gardener, but instead are the steward of your soil. This ensures that plants growing strong and healthy with minimal intervention required because you take care of the soil first. And we're going to go a little bit more deep into this topic a little bit later in this episode, but I do want to encourage you to look up some of the things that I have on soil and soil health here on the website or on the podcast, because I dive into this topic. This is kind of a soapbox. I'm sorry to say I do have a soapbox that I stand on, and that is that we are stewards of the soil and that we need to take care of our soil first. And that is a huge permaculture principle. And I wish I would have known that earlier. I know at the beginning of this episode, I talked about that question, what would I wish I would have known and done differently when I started? And I wish I would have known more about my soil. I wish I would have been not necessarily the expert, but at least been able to stand up for my soil and say that I need to put my soil first as a gardener. Also, to tell myself that I don't need to be that expert to do a soil test. I don't need to depend on others so much to fix my soil, but that I can do it. I have the tools, because if you do a soil test, your soil will tell you exactly what it needs. I wrote a book all about that journey. It's called Dirt: Finding the Solution to Building Soil Health. I'd love for you to read it. I will put the link in the show notes and in the description below. So I want to get into more benefits of permaculture in your garden. I want to get into the soil and all of those deep details. But now it is time for the tips and tricks segment of this episode, where I share a seasonal or beneficial tip that I use here at Red Ridge Farmstead with you. This week's tip is brought to you by the Building Soil Health Handbook. This handbook was designed to help you take the guessing out of improving your soil, to help you become the expert your soil has been waiting for you to be. Many of us think that we're gardeners of vegetables and gardeners of fruits, but we're not. We are stewards of the soil. In this handbook, I walk you through the 4 steps I've used here at the farm to improve my soil. I want to help you become the expert that you never realized you could be. To grab your free copy, go to redridgefarm.org/resources. This week's tip is all about your trees. Spring is a great time to be adding new trees to your homestead, creating that orchard of your dreams, but you need to take care of them and you need to mulch them. One of the biggest things that happen with fruit trees is they struggle when they have to compete with grass. So when you're digging that hole, make sure the hole is big enough, wide enough. Follow the instructions that you get from your grower. And that hole, don't put your grass clumps back into the hole or on top of the hole, because that grass will compete with the roots of a fruit tree. Fruit trees' roots grow very shallow, and the grass roots and the nutrients that grass takes up can rob your trees of the nutrients that they need to get going. So make sure you're mulching your trees in that whole area that you planted them and that whole area that you put the hole. Because the other thing that you want, if you want big trees that expand out and you don't want root-bound trees, you want to make sure that they get a big enough hole to get a good start. And mulching that is going to help you with weeds, and it's also going to help you lock in moisture. Because another thing that new trees need is a steady amount of water. Yes, spring, we get lots of rain and watering is amazing. But when that tree gets into midsummer, when there's going to be less water, especially in your higher latitudes and your higher temperatures in the summer, mulch is going to help that soil around your tree's root ball hold moisture longer between waterings. So remember, when you're planting your trees this spring, be sure to add mulch to your cart or grab a couple bags of mulch when you are picking up your trees. Okay, let's get back to this idea of bringing permaculture not only onto our homestead, not only into our backyard, but into our garden. We talked a little bit about how it can help, but let's go a little bit deeper into the benefits of permaculture in your garden specifically. Permaculture offers many benefits for your garden that extend beyond just the plants themselves. One of the biggest advantages is the creation of self-sustaining ecosystems that helps to maintain a healthy balance between all the different elements present in your garden. By using permaculture techniques like composting, no-till, and cover crops, you can create an environment that is rich in nutrients and beneficial microorganisms. This helps to keep plants healthy and strong while also reducing the need for harmful fertilizers and pesticides. But also when we go into permaculture, we find that especially when we're talking about chemicals or adding amendments to our soil or adding things to our garden, what happens is when we create an ecosystem that is balanced, like a forest or a meadow or by a lake, the natural system will take care of itself, and we don't need to bring in it could be chemicals, but technically we don't really need to bring in a lot of other outside sources, because you can easily create nutrients, fertilizers for your garden by composting what grew last year. Because what you're doing is you're essentially taking what grew, composting it, breaking it down. All those same nutrients that it took to grow that plant is inside that plant. So when we compost it and put it back on our soil, we're benefiting it. No-till means that we're not destroying that ecosystem that's so essential in the soil for microorganisms. And cover crops, we're covering the soil like nature or God does out in the forest. Those leaves fall, the soil's covered. If you ever go out to a forest, I ask you to, yes, have a beautiful walk, but also pull back those leaves and look at how deep and rich that soil is. And all that is God's creation naturally composting and covering the soil. Another benefit of permaculture is the way it helps to conserve resources like water and energy. By using techniques like rainwater harvesting, mulch, and companion planting, you can reduce the amount of water and other resources needed to maintain your garden. This not only saves you time and money, but also helps to reduce your overall environmental impact. When we talk about rainwater harvesting, the rain comes down. We can easily utilize that by just storing it. Now, there's lots of systems to it. You don't even have to use a barrel. You don't even have to even think about storing a lot of water. You can think of rainwater harvesting also as, how does your property lay? How does the rainwater naturally, maybe you have a slight hill, maybe you don't have a slight hill, maybe you have a valley. How is your property designed? How does it flow? And how does the water move across that property? And that can help you put your garden in a more logical place that maybe water does build up a little bit more in the spring. It doesn't create a lake or something like that, but you get more rainwater stored up in that area when it does rain, so that you get that, but you also have a spot too. It's kind of a mix with the garden. You need a place that can collect rainwater and hold it for a little bit longer than, say, a hill, but not hold it so long that it becomes a lake or a little pond in your backyard, but that it holds it, it will release it. The soil does have time to dry out and it's not a mud hole. So be thinking about how your rainwater moves across your property. Mulch is a great way that once you have watered, especially if you use sprinklers, the mulch in a path, the mulch on your garden itself, on your beds, if you do lay down some mulch on your beds, they help keep the moisture in the soil longer so you don't have to use as much water. And companion planting pretty much just doubles the amount of plants that you can put in your garden and utilize the space very efficiently. I was not a huge companion planter. I was more of the back of the seed packet said by rows. I've eventually now have turned my whole garden into no-till beds. So I have permanent beds. They're about 30 inches wide. Some are 20 feet, some are 30, but I usually base my beds when I'm garden planting off 10-foot parameters, 30 inches by 10 feet. And in that, if I'm planting tomatoes, and it may take a while for my tomatoes to really get big and thrive, I can plant spinach alongside it. So I'm technically getting 2 harvests from the same piece of area. That's permaculture, but it's also just common sense. So let's get into the getting started with permaculture in your backyard or on your little homestead or in your garden. If you're ready to dive into the world of permaculture and transform your backyard into a sustainable and thriving ecosystem, then there's a few key steps that you can take to get started. First is take some time to observe your space and understand the natural processes that are already at play. I talked about that a little bit with the rainwater and how it moves after a large storm. And if you can keep track of that, then that can maybe help you design where you're going to put your garden, where you're going to put your animal shelters. And I go way more in deep in that podcast episode series on homestead design. But you want to start watching your property. And essentially what you're doing is you're just watching how God's creation moves across your property and interacts with your property. You also want to watch the sun, because the sun is going to move across your property differently during different seasons. Here on our homestead, when we built our house, one of the big things that we wanted to do, and that goes into homestead design, is we wanted a home that benefited from solar heat. Now, we didn't go extravagant. We didn't go huge with all of the sunroom and little extra expenses. All we did was make sure that our home was oriented in the proper direction so that we did have one wall facing south. And that one wall, I concentrated to make sure it was mostly living areas. Yes, we have a few bedrooms along that wall, but most of the downstairs, we have two stories. Most of the downstairs rooms that are facing that south wall are rooms that we live in. Lots. It's my growing room and the school room when we were doing school downstairs. Now with teenagers, they kind of just do school wherever they want to. But upstairs, that's where our main living room is, and our kitchen, and the boys' bedroom, so that they get good warmth sunlight coming in those windows. And all we did was design in the living room area is instead of having windows that were only certain size and there was more wall than windows, we just went with more windows than wall. And that just allows more sun to come in to those windows. But we also oriented it not directly south, but a little bit cockeyed, because the sun, the way it works on the way our property is, and the way you will probably see this on your property, is that in the winter, fall, the sun comes up more northeast, and then in the middle of the summer, it's directly east, and then the middle of this late spring, end of winter, it's more southeast. By orienting your garden, your home, the trees, your orchard, whatever you're wanting to grow, to make sure that they get the most sun during the different seasons is important. So take time to look and see how it moves across your property and how just other systems work on your property. Next, focus on building healthy soil by adding compost, mulch, and other organics matters. This will help support a diverse array of microorganisms that are key to a thriving ecosystem. Now we're going to dive into that subject a little bit deeper in just a minute. But once you have a good foundation in place, you can start experimenting with permaculture techniques like companion planting, rainwater harvesting. Remember, that doesn't have to mean you put it in a barrel, even though it's amazing. I currently have several barrels and a huge tank on my property, and just off of one half of the roof of our home, we can gather in one rainstorm probably about 5,000 gallons of water. It's a lot of water. These strategies can help you bring more abundance to your property while also conserving resources like water and energy. By taking a holistic approach to gardening and focusing on the bigger picture, I think that sometimes what we forget is that bigger picture. We don't look at our garden 5 years from now or 10 years from now. We look at it today, and we look at how we want to, maybe you're wanting to start a garden and you're only looking at right now. But I really do suggest, and that's one permaculture principle, is that you look at now and you try to look at what 5 years from now is going to be. So no, you may not be able to put in all the rose beds around your garden just yet, but you can make the plan and you can draw it out, and you can draw where you hope to expand next year or you hope to expand 3 years from now, so that when you're creating that design on your homestead, you're prepared to grow more and to slowly integrate the different systems into your garden and backyard. So we're going to dive deeper into the permaculture permaculture techniques to boost your soil and health and biodiversity in just a moment, but now it is time for the Growing with God segment of this episode, where you and I dive into the Bible and learn more about our Lord and Savior. This week, we're going to be continuing our study into Hebrews 11 and our little Bible study on faith in action. We've already read through 1 through 12, and today we're going to read through 13 through 16. If you'd like to read along with me, I'm reading out of the NIV translation. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. This reminds us that all of the people that we've been talking about in these verses, Abraham, Sarah, Noah, Cain, Abel, they were all exhibiting their faith in God and believing in who God was. And God chose them for special purposes, in a way, so that we can learn from them. And in these verses, 13 through 16, it's kind of doing that. In a way, it ties almost to John 3:16, where God says that through our faith, when we believe, we are given eternal life. And it says in 15, if they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. So if they would not rested their trust in God, if Abraham wouldn't have picked up everything and only focused on God and what God could provide for him and the promises that he said that he would do, if he thought about his old life or if he thought about his old ways, he probably would have returned, because God asked him to step out in faith and leave everything. What about Noah? He not only stepped out in faith to leave everything, but literally everything, all of mankind was wiped out in front of him. By his faith, he stepped out with God and condemned the world right alongside him. And because of that, he was an heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. So when we step out in our walk, when we step out in our belief, we can't think back to the old life and how the old life was and how the ties that pulled us there. We have to stay in that faith and we have to look forward to the promise. If we think back on the old things and we don't change our minds and souls to become a new person, then we can think that we can return to our old ways. God here is saying that it's our faith, in fact, our faith in action, that is going to draw us closer to Him, because we're going to be longing for that better country, that heavenly one, and that God is preparing a city. Here it's talking about how He was preparing a city for them, but with Jesus now, He is also preparing a city for us. John 3:16 says that for God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son, so that for who all believe in Him may have eternal life. Even Jesus says in John that He is preparing a place for us, a city of gold, a city of no worries, a place of rest, a place of peace. And not only that, but a place where we can walk hand in hand with our Lord. Isn't that amazing? So I want to remind you this week that when you step out in faith, that sometimes means not looking back, but looking forward to what is to come. So let's get back to discussing permaculture in our garden. In order to truly embrace permaculture and create a thriving garden, it's important to not only establish a solid foundation, but also incorporate specific techniques that can boost soil health and biodiversity. One of the simplest ways to do this is through companion planting, which involves growing different plants together in a way that benefits each other. For example, the very common one is the Three Sisters, right? Planting beans and peas with corn to help the peas and beans fix in nitrogen, where corn takes a lot of nitrogen out. And then you also have your squash or pumpkins that you put in there because they cover the ground very easily and readily with all their vines and create a perfect mulch so that the corn and the peas and the beans are getting great amounts of water storage. And you can also think about, I use marigolds. After I pull that spinach crop out, I put in marigolds. I was describing before when I plant my tomatoes, so that the marigolds help keep the pests away from my tomatoes. I also do that with my cabbage because I have a lot of cabbage moths here on my property, and they get into my cabbage and my broccoli and all of that fun stuff. So companion planting can really dive deep into how like the beans and peas, because they're nitrogen fixers, help corn and other things grow. You can also think about this when you are crop rotating. If you have a broccoli in one row this year and then next year you put peas and beans and you concentrate on only putting nitrogen fixers there, you're going to naturally amend that soil with a boost from what that broccoli and that heavy nitrogen feeding plant pulled away from it. So you can use different crop rotation techniques too and think about when you are also creating that companion system. A great book to look into about this is called Carrots Love Tomatoes. It's a great book. I've only read the first chapter so far, but I loved it. I want to dive deeper into it. It's on my reading list for this year. I just haven't gotten to it yet, but it's a great book to pick up. And I will put the link or the description of the book in the show notes because it's important. I know you are busy. I'm busy. That you're probably maybe listening to this while you're folding your laundry, or you are driving, or you're out weeding in your garden, and you want to keep this knowledge and remember it and not have to re-listen to it maybe, or you want to take notes, but you're busy doing something else. Go to the show notes. It's a place on my website where there is either a blog, a full blog all about this, where I put lots of links for you, describe things a little bit more deeper, and it's just a place where I can dive deeper, essentially more than the little description box below. So be sure to go over and check out the show notes. So I know we talked about rainwater, but we need to think about rainwater harvesting and collecting in also conserving and also reducing erosion and runoff, which can damage our soil over time. For example, I want to talk to you a little bit about my property, my garden. When I first started my garden, essentially we live on a hill. And if you ever followed me on Instagram or Facebook, you can kind of see our property and how we are oriented. Our house is actually kind of built into the hill. My garden was on the flattest place I could find. And slowly over years, I've actually started to use our hill as a benefit because a garden on a slight grade helps with water retention, especially if we place our beds against the grade so that as that rain flows down the hill into my garden, it doesn't create as much runoff because the beds aren't faced with it and kind of creating valleys. And remember, water flows in the easiest direction it can. And when we create maybe our path in the direction of the hill, that water is just going to go right down the path and take our soil away. But by changing the beds so that my paths were actually the other direction from the hill, that slowed that water down. Now I go into a deeper podcast episode and blog post all about rainwater and if rainwater collecting is, if it's for you, how you can measure how much your roof will give you in a rainstorm and more. And I'll put that also in the show notes below. But if you're not ready for this step by step and are just developing a garden, you can focus on just establishing those beds to help you collect water. The next thing is having benefits in the soil, and having a good foundation in our soil can also help with natural pest control. And it helps to reduce the pesticides that you have to purchase that can create harm to the environment and disrupt the delicate balance of your garden. One effective method is introducing beneficial insects like ladybugs or lacewings. But you can introduce them, but if you don't have the infrastructure or the place where they can create a home, that's why this permaculture talks about biodiversity, creating an ecosystem. You want to be able to do both. And that's why those hedges around the edge of my garden are so important, because I'm creating that ecosystem. I also have bird nests or bird boxes around my garden so that the birds naturally nest there I don't feed the birds because if you feed the birds, they're not going to go after your aphids and pests and your flying insects. That's why I've truly decreased a lot of the cabbage moths on my property by putting those bird houses in, and it created that biodiversity and brings those animals into my property on purpose, and then they're eating those flying bugs that zoom across my garden. I now have 2 turtle doves that stay pretty close to the garden and another couple pigeons. And finally, with your soil, incorporating compost should become a gardening routine. And it's an excellent way to boost your soil health and promote biodiversity. Composting involves creating a nutrient-rich mixture of organic materials like food scraps and yard waste, which can be then used as natural fertilizers for your plants. One of the huge permaculture principles is to reduce waste and conserve resources. And compost is a great way to do this because you're closing the circle. A lot of times on our property, especially backyards in our cities, we have people that I personally don't, but we have the trucks and we have the different trash barrels that this goes to the compost area and this goes to the trash and this goes to the recycling bin. And all of that is great, but it still costs energy and it still uses carbon fuels to haul that away from your yard. It costs lots of fuel to utilize and run huge recycling bins and to run huge compost areas. And a lot of the compost areas, sometimes that isn't reusable because there's other people along beside you and next to you that may not be organic farmers or organic growers. So their waste, their yard waste, may have chemicals in them. A lot of people think that they don't use chemicals in their garden. When I go out looking for compost materials, which I haven't had to do in a while when I added my goats to our property, but I have to ask them, do you use weed and feed? And they're like, oh yeah, I use weed and feed all the time. But then they're trying to get rid of their scraps and their yard waste, saying that it's organic, that they don't use anything. Because a lot of people don't realize that weed and feed, they see the feed part of it and they want to promote their green grass and all of those things, but the weed side of it is strong herbicides that kill plants. Yes, it kills only certain kind of plants, broadleaf plants, but isn't that what you grow in your garden? That's really detrimental. By utilizing your own waste, by creating a system in your own backyard, out of your own home that utilizes the waste that you're already using, you're not shipping it off, you're closing in circles and you're reducing not only carbon emissions and fuel that it takes to ship that somewhere else, you are reducing your essential waste and your carbon footprint. And a compost pile is very easy to utilize. It doesn't stink if you maintain it properly. And it's one of the biggest benefits we've started to utilize on our homestead. I know when I was first gardening and the amounts of compost that they were telling me in these books, these mentor books that I was reading, that I needed to put on there, I was just shocked because I thought I was going to have to spend loads of money. But once I learned about the permaculture principles of closing my circles, what I mean by circles, you eat the food and then it goes somewhere to the trash. Well, that's an open circle. Closing a circle means that I'm keeping that trash here on my property and giving it another benefit. So example, in my barn, I have my animals. My dairy girls produce milk for me. I'm closing a small circle because I'm not having to outsource my dairy. I create my own dairy products, my own milk for us to drink. But then the poo and the hay that I do have to purchase because I don't have the property to grow our own hay, I don't send it off farm. I keep it here because the waste that my goats have, the poo that they also create, goes in my compost pile and I'm not shipping it off somewhere. I'm keeping it here. So I'm closing that circle. So by incorporating these permaculture techniques, you can take your gardening to the next level and create a truly sustainable and thriving ecosystem in your own backyard. In conclusion, permaculture is more than just a gardening method. It's a mindset shift towards building a sustainable and regenerative world. By following its principles, you can create a garden that not only provides for you, but also for your environment. From boosting your soil health to promoting biodiversity, permaculture offers solutions to many of the issues traditional gardeners face. So why not give it a try? Start small, experiment, have fun while you're discovering these amazing benefits that permaculture can bring to your garden and your life. As permaculture pioneer Bill Mollison once said, he's the founder, essentially, of permaculture. Though the problems of the world are increasingly complex, the solutions remain embarrassingly simple. Permaculture is one of those simple solutions because it brings God's creation to life. God created these simple solutions to lots of problems that we have when we grow. So it's time for us to stop waiting and embrace it. To dive deeper into bringing more abundance to your garden or even your purposeful growing journey, be sure to check out the Purposeful Growing Success Path. I talked about it earlier, and I went through those 6 stages that are designed to walk all growers through to create a purposeful life. I want to thank you for joining me here in this episode of the Pray Just Plant podcast. And as always, don't let the world hold you back. Pray, just plant.